Of politics first to give us some analysis on this. Well, thanks for joining us here on RT, Marcus. One of the key suspects in the Paris massacre claims to have arrived with the migrant influx to Europe. Could that also be a concern with today's attacks?
Oh, certainly. But first and foremost, I would like to say that our thoughts today should be with the victims of these monstrous terrorist attacks. And these terrorist attacks today in Brussels demonstrate the evil nature of Islamism. But unfortunately, we're going to have to get to the roots of these terrorist attacks. And the roots of these terrorist attacks is Western foreign policy. For the last 30 years or so, America in particular, but also Britain and France, has been working with Islamist terrorists to try and achieve geostrategic objectives. And this is what happens when you get into bed with repugnant, dangerous, extremist people. It comes back to haunt you. In Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Americans and the British, they were supporting the Mujahideen against the Russians, including bin Laden. In the 1990s, during the Bosnian Civil War, the Americans facilitated the arrival of Mujahideen fighters into Bosnia to fight the Serbs, because of course the Serbs were fighting the Islamists, the Americans were anti-Serb, but the Americans brought Mujahideen fighters into Europe. The Americans then invaded Iraq, and they've turned Iraq into a hotbed of Islamic fundamentalism. Britain and France intervened in Libya and have turned that into a failed state, and now it is ruled by various Islamist groups, including ISIS. And of course, America, Britain and France and their regional allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, have been supporting Islamist groups in Syria to try and overthrow the Syrian government. And I just urge people in Western capitals watching this interview and other interviews on RT today, please understand the reasons for the terrible terrorist attacks in Brussels and in Paris. We have to analyse Western foreign policy, and by doing so we will see that the West has brought these terrorist attacks on their very own people.
Now, Mr. Papadopoulos, we've just heard from the French President François Hollande, who said the world is facing a global terror threat. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, of course it is. But there's more than meets the eye to this, because Syria, for example, or the Syrian people on a daily basis are victims of terrorist attacks. And those terrorists who are carrying out those attacks against Syrian people up and down the country on a daily basis have been backed by America, Britain and France and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So the French president, of course he's right that there's a global threat from terrorism, but France has played an important role in bringing this terrorist threat to the streets of, for example, Paris. So it's very duplicitous for François Hollande and other Western leaders to simply say that the world is facing a serious threat from terrorism. Of course we are facing a threat from Islamist terrorism, but the threat from Islamist terrorism would not be nowhere near as powerful as it is today without the support they receive from the West, and the West uses them to try and achieve geostrategic objectives.
And Mr. Papadopoulos, you obviously mentioned the foreign policy there as one of the root causes and indeed the catalyst for these and similar attacks across Europe. What is the answer in the short and medium run to stop this happening again? We've seen tightening security along the EU borders, the Schengen visa-free travel zone, Belgium on the highest terror alert threat in quite a while now. Is more security the answer to these attacks, or should we be looking elsewhere for solutions?
In the immediate term, Europe has to have borders again. Schengen has failed and it is finished. But if we want to tackle the reasons for the terrorist threat in the long term, and we must always think of the long term, we have got to see an end to Western foreign policy in which it uses Islamist fighters to try and achieve geostrategic objectives. So Syria, at the moment, is the principal route for Islamist terrorism at this very point in time. So in order to reduce the threat that Europe is facing from Islamist terrorism, the West and its regional allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, must end all forms of support to all militant groups in Syria. The Americans and the British and the French have to tell Turkey, close your border with Syria. Do not allow Islamist fighters to cross into Syria anymore. Do not allow jihadists to cross from Turkey into Syria anymore. And eventually, the terrorists in Syria, the Islamist fighters, will be starved. And the Syrian army, which is the heart and soul in the fight against Islamist terrorism, backed by the Russian military, will eventually be able to liberate more and more territory, which is currently occupied by ISIS, al-Nusra, the Free Syrian Army, who are all Islamist groups. But in the long term, if you're going to defeat Islamist terrorism, the West and its regional allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, must stop supporting Islamist terrorists, and we must focus on Syria. And I just hope people watching this interview will understand that the Syrian army, as I said just now, is the heart and soul in the fight against Islamist terrorism. They are the ones that are fighting them 24/7, up and down Syria, killing them, destroying them every single day of the week. And the West is supporting the terrorists that the Syrian army is fighting. It is an absolute appalling, intolerable situation, and it's something that ordinary people in the West must be aware of, and we must do something about.
Mr. Papadopoulos, if we can just focus on the Belgian attacks for now. There are reports that Belgian intelligence had some general information about these potential attacks beforehand. If so, could they have done more to prevent them?
Well, I think these are very, very early days. We need to let the Belgian authorities fully investigate the heinous terrorist attacks which occur today. And then we will be able to see, could they have been prevented? But of course, there's always going to be what we call lone wolves, and that no intelligence service in the world is able to fully cater and prevent terrorist attacks by lone wolves. So unfortunately, if that is what's happened in Brussels today, it's very little the Belgian authorities could have done to prevent that. But as I said, it's very early days, and we just have to wait and see for the investigation and the findings of the investigation by the Belgian authorities.
Now, after the deadly terror attacks in Ankara, of course, the Brussels attacks aren't the first ones we've seen this month, tragically. The Turkish President, Tayyip Erdogan, he warned that Europe, and in fact specifically Brussels, could be the target of such attacks. Let's just take a quick listen before we come back to you to what he said.
There is no reason why the bomb that's exploded in Ankara cannot explode in Brussels or in any other European city.
You mentioned some of the regional players there in that Syrian conflict, which has obviously contributed to such terror attacks. Could the Turkish government also do more, as you mentioned earlier, to contribute to this anti-terror coalition to prevent these attacks reaching Europe?
I would ignore people watching this interview to ignore anything that comes from the Turkish government, anything that comes from the Turkish President Erdogan. Look, Turkey has played a crucial role in the Syrian conflict. They're the ones who have been helping, who have allowed Turkey to become a training camp for Islamist terrorists to go into Syria. And we know it's very, very well documented, and it's been persuasively shown that Erdogan, who is making these claims that terrorism threatens the world, he's actually personally linked to ISIS. His family have been benefiting financially from ISIS oil lines, which have been going from Syria into Turkey. Now, ISIS, of course, in the last year or so, has taken over, regrettably, oil fields in Syria. They've managed to push the Syrian army out. And ISIS has been selling oil to Turkey. And Erdogan, the Turkish president, a close friend and ally of America, of Britain and France, has been benefiting financially. It's, to put it quite simply, no Turkey, no ISIS. No Turkey, no al-Nusra. No Turkey, no terrorism threat to Europe. But also there's a slightly bigger picture here, because Turkey is a puppet of the West, and in particular America. And America has given the green light to Turkey to destabilise Syria, to use Islamist terrorists, jihadists, to try and destroy the Syrian government. Because what the West and its regional allies are trying to achieve in Syria is the overthrow of the Syrian government, and by doing that they would end Russian power and influence in the Middle East, and Iranian power and influence in the Middle East. It's a game of chess the West and its regional allies are playing. However, it is ordinary people who are suffering, ordinary people in Syria, ordinary people in Paris, and today ordinary people in Brussels.
Mr. Papadopoulos, we're just receiving reports that Islamic State have claimed responsibility for the attacks in Brussels. Does this mean that we should expect more? And what about the timing of such attacks?
Of course, unfortunately, Europe now, London, Berlin, Paris, Brussels, is now faced with a potent terrorist threat on a daily basis. And of course ISIS is the most dangerous of all the Islamist terrorist groups. And, you know, we have to try and defend ourselves against them. We need close cooperation between European governments and also the Russian government, which of course the British government won't be happy with, but Russia is up there in the front, along with the Syrian government, in fighting Islamist terrorism. So we need international cooperation between all governments to try and defeat the threat from ISIS and other Islamist terrorist groups. However, as I keep on reiterating, we must get to the crux of this threat. We must get to the roots of this threat, and this is Western foreign policy. All we have to do is go to North Africa. We go to Libya. Libya has become a failed state because of Western intervention there. It's lost control. There's no central government power. ISIS has a firm presence in Libya. ISIS is starting to relocate some of its resources from Syria to Libya because ISIS understands that it's going to lose eventually in Syria, so they're moving to Libya. But who's caused the mess in Libya? Prior to Western, British and French intervention in Libya, when Gaddafi was running Libya, whatever people thought of Gaddafi, he ensured that Islamists did not have a presence in Libya. However, the British and the French in 2011, they worked with various Islamist groups to overthrow Gaddafi. And what happened? Libya has now become a failed state. It is divided, it is ruled by various Islamist groups, and it is a geographical springboard into Europe, because of course Libya is not far from Italy, and so ISIS really is in a very strong position to keep on threatening Europe on a daily basis because now of its base in Libya. And who is responsible for that? It is Britain and France and of course America, who gave the go-ahead to London and Paris to intervene and overthrow Gaddafi in 2011.
Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher, editor of Politics First, thanks so much for joining us here on RT International. Thanks for your analysis on that.
Thank you.